So season 1 of House of the Dragon just wrapped up, and honestly, I really liked it. Great acting, great build-up, character development. I'm not a review channel, but I liked it. Also, from here on out, spoilers for the series and maybe Game of Thrones. I was originally going to make a video looking at every little historical inspiration I could find on the series, like the Hagia Sophia, or the death of Blackbeard, or how Viserys is like Louis XVI, but then I decided instead I would focus on the main theme that the series explores, which is female heads of state. Even in the trailer, it is obvious that one of the main points of contention in the series would be Rhaenyra's claim to the throne on account of the fact that she is a woman. Further, this concept reminded me of another idea that is often talked about jokingly or otherwise in our society.
A world where women were running half our countries and companies would be a safer and much more prosperous world.
Men cause all war. That is somehow or another some weird fact that slipped us by.
If women were presidents all over the world would be a safer place, it would be a more peaceful place.
So in this video, I want to look a bit at female heads of state in history, especially in Europe. Why was there opposition to women in power? How often did it come to pass that women actually were in power despite this? Were women actually more peaceful or competent rulers, as some people claim? And maybe most interestingly, what influence did powerful women have despite largely being excluded from positions of power? Then we'll take all that info and compare it to House of the Dragon and see if it portrays anything historically accurately. We'll dive into that right now, but first remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell for more content. So let's start by looking at why women were generally excluded from power in historical European succession. Part of this, as you can imagine, was just like sexism. Many people, both men and women, had the idea that women were not capable of rule, usually due to being physically weak and less capable or incapable of reasonable thought. Women were often raised in ways that perpetuated this, and in general, women were relegated to the home and the private sphere, although this wasn't generally seen as a lesser role necessarily. Many of these ideas, of course, we have largely moved away from in modern Western societies. Another reason is the patrilineal lineage system that most societies throughout history, including ours, generally adhere to. While patrilineal can mean slightly different things depending on context, here I am referring to the idea that a family name passes through the generations in a patrilineal fashion. Chances are you have the last name of your father, and he probably has the last name of his father, and so on and so forth. And on the flip side of that coin, your mother may have given up her maiden name and took her husband's name instead. In this way, a family name and lineage is passed down through men rather than women. Don't know why that is the case necessarily, or when it started, and that can be debated, but we know that most cultures in the world, historically and even now, are patrilineal in this way. But it makes sense that a society would generally have to pick one or the other, because, if everyone took both of their parents' names, then in a couple generations, everyone's last names would be really long and just make no sense. So, what does this have to do with women coming to the throne? Even though our society is patrilineal, we do still have concepts of equality for women socially and materially, so those two concepts certainly aren't mutually exclusive. But the issue is this, and I'll use Game of Thrones houses and characters to illustrate my point. Let's say we have House Stark and House Lannister, and let's say Sansa and Jaime get married. In a patrilineal system, Sansa might take the Lannister name, and for sure, her children will be Lannisters, even if she decides to keep the name Stark. This means that if Sansa became Queen of the North, then when she dies, the North would then belong to the Lannisters, her children, not the Starks. Obviously, this is bad news for the Starks, who don't just lose their legacy, but their ability to rule and their power. If we continue this logic a few generations, then let's say a Lannister man marries a Baratheon woman and she becomes Queen of the Stormlands. Her children will be Lannisters, and then the Lannisters control the north and the Stormlands and Casterly Rock, and the cycle would continue until everyone is all in one house, which leaves a lot of very angry and powerful families, which leads to... But if Sansa can't be queen, then there's no issue. The Starks don't take Casterly Rock, and the Lannisters don't take the north, and houses can both survive in power and live happily ever after. We actually see a discussion of this in House of the Dragon when Viserys betroths Rhaenyra to Laenor, and the patriarchs of those two families hash it out.
In keeping with Westerosi tradition, their children would take their father's name.
Laenor and Rhaenyra's children shall take their father's name. However, at such time when their firstborn ascends the Iron Throne, he or she will do so bearing the name Targaryen.
This obviously would fix the issue we were just talking about, but it's more complicated, and maybe that's why people didn't do it as often. And concern that one country would take over another through female succession, like we just saw with Starks and Lannisters, led to the reintroduction of something called Salic Law in France in the 14th century. Salic Law actually started in the early 500s with the Frankish king Clovis I in an attempt to codify and standardize laws in the Frankish realm, mostly drawing upon the traditions of Rome. The Salic Laws actually covered a lot of stuff, from criminal law to the judicial system, and of course, inheritance. On top of calling for equal division of inheritance between male heirs, the laws also drew a line in the sand between men and women. Women were allowed to inherit personal possessions, including buildings, but the inheritance of the land, and by extension the titles, went to men. Quote, "Of Salic land, no proportion of the inheritance shall come to a woman, but the whole inheritance of the land shall come to the male sex." Other translations make it clear that this refers to all sons, quote, instead of the male sex, members of the male sex who are brothers. But Salic Law started to go out of fashion. In a couple instances, division of the Frankish realm between sons led to war. And the final partition after Louis I made sure that the Frankish Empire would never unify again, with the West becoming France, the East becoming Germany, and the center fragmenting into a million pieces and being fought over by the other two. Obviously, if we think about this for a bit, we can see how after a few generations, this would lead to a bunch of really small kingdoms getting smaller and smaller every generation, leading to scarcity and, of course, war. So the Salic Laws started to go out of style, and no one really paid attention to them for about 800 years. In those 8 centuries, something kind of incredible happened. Every single French ruler had a son to inherit the throne from them. But this streak came to an end in 1316 with Louis X. Louis had a daughter, Joanne, but his wife was still pregnant. In the meantime, Louis's brother took the throne and, interestingly, was assisted by another noble, Otto IV. Sound familiar? Louis's child was born and turned out to be a boy. Hooray. But he died after only a few short days. Again, sound familiar? Keep in mind, by this point, no one even knew what Salic Law really was, but nonetheless, people still had biases and personal interests to attend to. Philip crowned himself King of France, and Joanne contested, but ultimately the nobility decided to support Philip. It is worth noting that sexism may not have been the court's only motive here. Joanne at the time was only 4 years old, and her mother was an adulteress, and as such, it wasn't even fully known if she was actually Louis's son, although he did confirm she was his son on his deathbed. Her being 4 would of course make it hard for her to negotiate terms with nobles to win them over, while Philip was already a skilled statesman. Further, while she was excluded from the French crown, she went on to become the Queen of Navarre, which was a kingdom under her father. But karma struck, and Philip V died without a male heir as well after only 4 years, and his brother Charles IV took over and also died without a son. After only 12 years, another succession crisis struck France, and the question of women inheriting the throne came up again. Well, sort of. After the precedent of 1316, The French had agreed that a woman couldn't come to the throne, but there was still a technicality that had to be sorted out. The two main claimants to the throne after Charles's death were Philip, his cousin, and Edward III, who was his nephew through his sister, and, more problematically, the King of England. Edward's claim, however, was through his mother, Charles's sister, as his father was from another family. And thus the question arose, since Edward's connection to Charles was through a woman, did his claim stand? Keep in mind, the French really could have gone either way on this, and could have even reversed the understanding reached in 1316 had they wanted to, because nothing was written down. But in this instance, that would mean the King of England would come to power in France, just like our Lannister Stark example from earlier. So to prevent this, the French doubled down and said that male heirs could not inherit through a matrilineal line. This decision pissed off Edward and actually started the 100 Years' War. Later on, in 1413, this would be explicitly codified and tied back to the Salic Laws, which came back in style. Salic Law would then spread throughout other countries in Europe, with many later adopting a semi-Salic standard where women would be allowed to rule, but only if all the immediate male family was exhausted. We can see semi-Salic law at work in England after Queen Victoria came to power. Queen Victoria's ancestors had united the UK and Hanover. However, House Hanover operated under semi-Salic law, and with Victoria's ascension, she didn't inherit the Hanover crown, even though she was still the Queen of England, and her father had been King of Hanover and England. The title instead actually went to her uncle, the king's brother, and the united house broke with her. It is worth noting, however, that many kingdoms didn't have Salic law, such as Spain, as well as other smaller French kingdoms like Navarre and Brittany. So that roughly covers why women were excluded from rule in medieval Europe. Now we can look at the next question. Just how often did women rise to power despite Salic law? Some countries like France did have strict Salic law and have never had a female monarch, but many others never fully adopted this, and as such, have had some female rulers through their histories. Starting with England and Britain, there have been 62 monarchs, 7 of which have been women, and many of them are actually quite well known. Queen Jane, who only ruled for 9 days, Mary I, aka Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I, who was one of Europe's most influential monarchs, Mary II, Queen Anne, Queen Victoria, and of course Queen Elizabeth II, who was the UK's longest ruling monarch at 70 years. Scotland had its own pair of Marys and a Queen Margaret out of around 50 monarchs, minus Queen Anne, who unified England and Scotland. Spain had 7 female monarchs, if we include Aragon and Castile in that metric. The Austrian Habsburgs had only 1, Maria Theresa, while the Holy Roman Empire had 0. The Netherlands had 3, Portugal has had 2, Poland also had 2, and Russia's had 4 since the time of the Duchy of Moscow. These stats are obviously a bit skewed, since not all kingdoms started at the same time. A unified England, for example, has been around since the 9th century, while Russia, in the form of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, has been around since the 13th, and unified Spain since the 16th. That being said, virtually all European female leaders existed within the last 500 years, except for Poland, which had Queen Jadwiga in the 1300s. In researching other less prominent kingdoms, the trend of only a handful of female leaders stays consistent, usually in the single digits, around 5% of the leadership being female through time, although some areas stand out as having a larger number of female rulers, namely Ireland, Sardinia, Spain, England, of course, and Navarre. Other parts of the world in history, Hawaii, Japan, Tanzania, Darua, and the Ptolemaic Kingdom had much larger numbers or proportions of women having ruled, although it's worth noting with the Ptolemaic Kingdom that they operated in a brother-sister co-regency, so technically women only had half the power there. So in short, medieval and early modern European societies were not the most progressive on this front, but they were probably a bit more than the average society across the world. So let's look at the next question. Are there any significant differences between male and female rule, especially when it comes to war and peace? Pretty quickly, we can actually say the answer is no. Women are not necessarily better or worse rulers than men, and they are not more peaceful necessarily either. There are some exceptions to this for sure. Hatshepsut of Egypt's 18th dynasty was famously pacifistic in an otherwise expansionist and militaristic period of Egyptian history. She was perhaps the greatest monument builder of the Egyptian New Kingdom, and her avoidance of war was seen by her own son, Thutmose III, as so problematic that when she died, he had mentions of her name defaced, which in Egypt was a big deal, and then went on to be Egypt's greatest warrior king. That being said, in European history, there isn't that much of a trend of pacifistic women in power. Some were definitely remembered for their virtue and gentleness, such as Queen Jadwiga of Poland, who donated her vast wealth to charity and education, while heavily relying on diplomacy to keep out of war with the Teutonic Order. Queen Elizabeth I was also relatively peaceful, allowing for limited religious freedom in England and being purposely conservative with executions of state enemies. Maria Theresa of Austria, while having to fight a war to keep her right to rule, much like the House of the Dragon plot going forward, was largely responsible for creating the bureaucratic statism of Austria, which, while more dictatorial, generally improved the lives of her subjects by corralling abusive nobles. Many others, however, were not so kind or benevolent. Queen Mary I, Elizabeth's sister, was famously labeled Bloody Mary due to her religious purges of Catholics, having burned 300 people at the stake, a massive jump from her father, who only executed 81 people, usually not by burning them at the stake. Catherine the Great of Russia overthrew and likely killed her husband, then proceeded to use the King of Poland as her consort and lead the effort to fully partition Poland, a political maneuver that even in the ruthless world of the 18th century was seen as a gross violation of some international law. Queen Isabella of Spain, along with her husband, started the Spanish Inquisition, which over the next couple centuries likely killed hundreds of thousands of people, and she commissioned the first colonization of the New World under Columbus. Margaret of Austria, perhaps Netherlands' best female leader, went to war with France. Queen Victoria oversaw the expansion of colonialism in Africa. If we look more recently, Margaret Thatcher of the UK was extremely aggressive in the Cold War and went to war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands, which no one really cared about. That's not to say that all of these women leaders were awful, just to point out that they definitely couldn't be described as pacifist or more peaceful than the men who ruled at similar times. This obviously isn't a full survey to determine if female rulers have been more peaceful historically, but it certainly seems that most of the most influential female rulers have not been characterized by anything different than their male compatriots. They were strong leaders who defended or expanded their countries, often through force, from both internal and external enemies, to themselves or to the nation that they ruled. Truth be told, we probably wouldn't expect female leaders to be too much more peaceful than male leaders, in large part because anyone who would become a ruler has to deal with the same circumstances, and these circumstances aren't just going to change between men and women. Internal challengers to the political and social orders needed to be managed, hostile neighbors need to be checked or attacked, and diplomacy and peace, while generally being the best option, sometimes devolves into war inevitably, and a female leader really can't do much to change that. No leader can. It is worth noting, of course, that there is a difference between instigating war and defending from one like Maria Theresa and Elizabeth I, while some like Isabel and Catherine the Great were much more offensive. Further, we need to keep in mind that most anyone who becomes a ruler is generally going to be of a certain disagreeable temperament. They have to be willing to say no and have to be willing to back up their claims and policies. In an electoral system, only the tough and disagreeable will actually pursue positions of power, and in a hereditary system, the children are raised to be good at the game, i.e. being aggressive to some degree. In short, while I'd agree that on average women tend to be less aggressive than men, the women who get to positions of power are not the average, and neither are the men who get to positions of power. They are tougher and more aggressive than most men, and with that we would expect the idea of pacifism to kind of go out the window. That's obviously not to say that all rulers are always violent sociopaths, but it's true that violent sociopaths pursue positions of power more than people of mild-mannered or easygoing temperament. While we would expect the most violent leaders to be men, yes, maybe we could even expect more peaceful leaders to be women, their personality traits would often go by the wayside when the circumstances call for it, especially when you remember that rulers don't rule alone. An extremely violent man would probably be tempered to some degree by less violent people around him, and more agreeable women would be pushed to more aggressive means by the people around her. To sum up that point, pretty much in theory women might be more peaceful, but it really hasn't panned out historically. Perhaps the best summation of this dynamic, of a perhaps more agreeable person being able to take on the more aggressive elements of leadership, is presented in Queen Elizabeth's speech in Tilbury before the battle with the Spanish Armada in 1588. Quote, I'm not going to do an old English lady voice, I have always so behaved myself that, under God, I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and good will of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of the battle, to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and my people my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know that I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. So let's look at the last question we have about women in power. How did women influence things behind the scenes when they weren't the queen? The general answer is actually a lot. We certainly see this in House of the Dragon, especially with Alicent. For example, while generally sidelined, women could often come to rule through being a magistrate, where they would rule in the stead of their young or sick male relative. We see Alicent doing this in the later stages of Season 1, when the king is sick, and she is really calling the shots in his stead. This was enhanced by the fact that elite women were generally educated and took part in court regularly, especially if they were unmarried women in waiting. In this way, they would learn what was the best interest of their kingdom or house, learn how to leverage people on their side, and when they got married off, do what they could to influence their foreign husbands and their underlings to act in that interest. The best example of this may be Margaret of Burgundy, who, after being widowed twice, was assigned to rule for the Burgundies in the Netherlands, as the future ruler, Charles V, was not yet old enough. When he came of age and moved on to bigger and better things, he actually reinstated her as ruler in the Netherlands because she did such a good job the first time. She held this position until her death in 1530. Another, less flattering example is Isabella of France, also nicknamed the She-Wolf, who you will recall was Edward III's mother. Isabella was married off to the King of England, Edward II, Edward's father, before overthrowing him with a love interest of hers, Roger Mortimer. Isabella effectively ruled side by side with him, and she was a key part of ending the Scottish War by brokering treaties when others wanted more war. She then likely had her husband killed, and when her son Edward III was 18, she helped him depose Mortimer, and he was executed as well. Even her son was aware of her conniving ways and had her imprisoned for some time. She is an interesting example of how women exercised power at the time, and also demonstrates that women could be quite ruthless. Women would also closely advise their husbands and even educate them, especially in terms of language. The prominence of women in court would expand through the Renaissance, and influential figures like Baldassare Castiglione would author works that outlined the courtesies and expectations of court, a big part of which was women. Later, the French even tried to adopt this codified expectation, making them a more progressive court system than others, even if they still wouldn't allow women in full roles of power. The role of women in society did not go unnoticed, and while not common, works were written that exalted the famous and admirable women of history. Perhaps the most well-known example is a book called The Book of the City of Ladies, written by Christine di Pisan, a Franco-Italian writer of the Middle Ages. Written in 1503, Christine uses the allegory of creating a great city of the woman in history to explore the sex's greatest accomplishments, usually based around loyalty, moral strength, and purity. These, of course, aren't really the same concepts of feminism that we look at today, but it certainly gives us a window into how women's roles in the world were viewed historically, both by wider society and, of course, women themselves. So as a synopsis, women generally didn't rule for various reasons, including often unfounded concerns for their competence, succession issues in the patrilineal tradition, and a series of events relating to Salic Law and motivated succession crises in France, which rippled throughout Europe in the form of codified succession laws. When women did come to rule, usually in the single-digit percentages in Europe, they usually ruled in a similar manner to men, dispelling the idea that women in power leads to less conflict and war, as well as myths of women being less competent rulers. Some were good, some were bad, some were peaceful, some were cruel and violent. There are also some very famous rulers who have been women that were very successful, although you could assume that there is some selection bias, as women rulers were already on thin ice as it was, and would likely be removed or kept from power if they were seen to be less competent by the people around them. Outside of explicit leadership positions, women still had a role to play in court life, often being well educated and dedicated to their realm like their male compatriots, although their contributions on this front were generally in the form of marriage and influencing other rulers rather than final decision making. That being said, women still could come into institutional power, especially when their children were very young or their husbands very old. Occasionally, women would do well enough to retain or acquire these positions, and this likelihood increased as time went on in European history. So, how is this reflected in House of the Dragon? Well, we know that the issues of succession were often a major issue in medieval Europe, and women sometimes factored into that heavily, especially when they claimed the crown for their own sons and lobbied for them in court. We see this with Alicent trying to wage a cold war in the halls of King's Landing on behalf of Aegon in the lead-up and aftermath of the king's death, as well as Rhaenyra trying to secure Driftmark for her son. We know that women would exercise personal power over men and leverage them towards one decision or another, as seen when Rhaenyra convinces her father to support her son's claim to Driftmark. Alicent also essentially kidnaps Aegon and forces him to accept the throne, and tries to groom him as he grows for the role. We know that women controlled the household and even could inherit structures, and we sort of see this with Alicent redesigning the Red Keep and re-emphasizing a return to religious practice in this symbolism. We know that Rhaenyra's situation is probably most like Maria Theresa's in the 18th century, where she was named by her father, then had to fight a war against other nobles who sought to take that succession from her. We also see another historical example where the general succession issue is similar to that of the succession of 1318 in France, with a young boy dying, screwing up the inheritance issues, and a guy named Otto as a sort of hand of the king. The theme that we see of Alicent and Rhaenyra talking about their duty to the realm over their personal lives is a common theme as well, as this was an expectation of noblewomen especially, who often married into unhappy marriages to advance their family's interests. Alicent's hatred towards Rhaenyra in the middle part of the season is also justified historically on that point, as purity was seen as a major tenet of a woman's responsibility, and Rhaenyra's blatantly having bastard children completely flies in the face of this, especially when we remember that Alicent really took one for the team with marrying Viserys. Even the nebulous nature of the rules around women inheriting the throne is accurate, as even in France, there really wasn't a set precedent written into law until long after the succession issues. Instead, it was based on tradition, which in theory could be changed when appropriate, as there was no guiding documents, and we see people kind of trying to feel their way through this, and there not really being a solid idea of what to do when it came to female succession. In short, I think House of Dragons is quite accurate and really puts the whole woman in power concept in an interesting light. Women are shown to have the cards stacked against them, but they certainly still hold power. They also don't fully follow an ideology of doing what's best for themselves and finding themselves, and instead value their family and realm higher, a concept that is generally accepted through most of history, and a concept that was historically accurate for the time, despite being less in tune with modern female-centric media today. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. This wasn't by any means a comprehensive look at the history of women in power, but I think it sheds enough light on the concept to be useful. Anyways, remember to like, comment, subscribe for more content. I'll see you in the next one, everyone. Let me know. I'm sure I missed a whole bunch of stuff. I know there's a whole War of the Roses tint to a lot of all this stuff, which I didn't really get into at all. But I'll see you in the next one. Talk about it in the comments. Have a great day. Goodbye.